The morning sunlight poured through the window, illuminating the kitchen in a golden hue that did little to lift the weight of routine pressing down on me. I stood by the counter, spreading butter on toast with the same practiced motions I had repeated countless mornings before. Jason sat at the table, his face buried in the glow of his phone screen. The faint furrow in his brow told me he was already consumed by the demands of his day, even though the day had barely started. "Do you want eggs too, or just the toast?" I asked, my voice calm, but edged with a note of something I couldn't define. I had hoped the question would make him look up, maybe even meet my eyes. "Just toast," he replied without hesitation, his tone neutral, polite, but detached. He didn't look up, not really. I placed the plate in front of him and lingered, as if waiting for some acknowledgement. A thank you, a smile, anything that might remind me of the warmth we used to share. Instead, he took a bite, his eyes still fixed on his phone. "I'll be home late," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. "There's a client dinner, don't wait up." It wasn't the first time I'd heard this, and it wouldn't be the last. I nodded, trying to suppress the sting that came with the realization that this was what we had become, polite strangers occupying the same house. When he kissed me on the cheek before leaving, it was out of habit rather than affection. The door clicked shut behind him, and I stood there, still holding the dish towel in my hand, as if it were the only thing tethering me to the ground. The silence that followed felt heavier than his presence ever did. I wasn't angry with Jason. He was a good man, a man who worked tirelessly to provide for his family, who took his responsibilities seriously. But somewhere along the way, his dedication to his work had become a wall between us, and I was on the outside, staring at the smooth, impenetrable surface, wondering if he even noticed I was there. Later, as I drove to work, I found myself relieved to be away from the house. The office, at least, offered a kind of clarity. I had a role there, a purpose beyond the confines of being a wife and mother. People valued my opinions, listened when I spoke. It was a reprieve, a place where I could feel like myself, even if only for a few hours. When I walked into the office that morning, the air buzzed with anticipation. Whispers of the new regional manager's arrival had spread like wildfire. Edward Randall. The name had been on everyone's lips for days, accompanied by phrases like hard-hitting, charismatic, and results-driven. I had barely settled at my desk when he walked in. He didn't just enter the room, he commanded it. Tall, with an easy confidence that seemed almost unfair, he exuded the kind of presence that made everyone stop what they were doing, even if only for a moment. His dark hair was streaked with just enough gray to lend him an air of authority, and his sharp suit looked like it had been tailored for someone who was used to getting exactly what he wanted. His eyes scanned the room, assessing each of us with a precision that was both unsettling and impressive. When they landed on me, he smiled. Not the kind of smile you offer out of courtesy, but one that suggested he had already formed an opinion and liked what he saw. "Madeline Harper?" he asked, his voice steady, deliberate. I nodded, rising from my chair. "That's me." He extended a hand. "Edward Randall. Call me Ed. I've heard good things about you." The handshake was firm, his grip warm. It lasted just long enough to feel deliberate. I couldn't help but notice the way his eyes held mine, as if he were trying to see past the surface, to uncover something hidden beneath. "Thank you," I said, trying to match his calm demeanor, though my heartbeat betrayed me. "I'm looking forward to working together." "So am I," he said simply, his tone as measured as his movements. As the day unfolded, I found myself in a meeting with him and several other colleagues. He spoke with clarity and conviction, outlining his vision for the department with an enthusiasm that was contagious. But it wasn't just what he said that held my attention. It was the way he carried himself, the way he seemed to listen intently when someone spoke, as though their words mattered. When the meeting ended, he held the door open for me. Our eyes met briefly, and I felt a strange flicker of something I couldn't name, a feeling I hadn't felt in years. By the time I left the office that evening, my mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. Jason was already home when I arrived, sitting on the couch with his laptop balanced on his knees. He glanced up, smiled briefly, then returned to his work. I wanted to tell him about my day, about the new manager, about how different everything felt, but the words caught in my throat, and I let the moment pass. Instead, I went to bed early, curling up under the covers as Jason worked late into the night. As I stared at the ceiling, my mind drifted back to Ed. It wasn't his looks or his charm that lingered. It was the way he had made me feel, if only for a moment. Seen, heard, and it terrified me how much I had missed that feeling. The day started like any other, with the hum of office chatter providing a backdrop to my thoughts. Ed had called a morning meeting, gathering a select group of us to discuss a new project, a high-profile campaign that, as he put it, could redefine the direction of the department. His enthusiasm filled the room, pulling even the most jaded among us into his orbit. "Madeline," he said, turning his attention to me, "I want you to take the lead on this. Your organizational skills and attention to detail are exactly what this needs." His words caught me off guard. I was used to praise, but something about the way he said it, measured, deliberate, felt different. My colleagues exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement, others with raised eyebrows. I sat straighter in my chair, trying to ignore the way my pulse quickened. "Of course," I replied, keeping my tone professional. "I'll make sure it's a success." Ed's smile lingered a fraction longer than it should have, but he quickly shifted his focus back to the room. I spent the rest of the meeting scribbling notes, but his voice stayed with me, like an echo that refused to fade. By the time the day stretched into evening, the office had emptied out, leaving only the occasional hum of a copier or the faint buzz of fluorescent lights. I was seated in a small conference room, papers and sticky notes scattered across the table. The project was ambitious, and I was determined to prove that his confidence in me wasn't misplaced. A knock on the glass door startled me. I looked up to see Ed standing there, his suit jacket draped over his arm, and his tie slightly loosened. He gestured toward the chair opposite me. "Mind if I join you? Thought I'd check on how it's going." "Of course," I said, though his presence made the room feel suddenly smaller. He sat down, leaning forward to examine the notes in front of me. "You've already made progress. Impressive." "I wanted to make sure we're on track," I said, grateful that my voice sounded steady. For the next hour, we worked side by side, his energy infectious. He had a way of simplifying complex ideas, of framing challenges as opportunities. It wasn't just his intellect that struck me, but the way he made me feel. Capable, valued. It was a stark contrast to the version of myself I had become at home. At some point, the conversation drifted away from the project. He leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "You know," he began, "there's something about nights like these. They remind me of when I first started in this business. Long hours, big dreams, and no clue what I was doing." I laughed softly, unsure if he was being modest or genuine. "It's hard to imagine you not having it all figured out." "Oh, trust me, I've made my share of mistakes." His tone grew softer, more introspective. "There was a time when I thought success was all that mattered, but I learned the hard way that it doesn't mean much if you don't have someone to share it with." The vulnerability in his voice caught me off guard. I wasn't sure what to say, so I simply nodded, letting his words settle in the space between us. He turned the conversation back to me, asking questions about my life, my ambitions. It was the kind of genuine interest I hadn't felt in years. As the clock ticked past 9, I began gathering my things. "I should probably head home," I said, though a part of me wished I could stay a little longer. Ed stood as well, walking with me to the door. "Thank you for staying late," he said, his voice warm. "You've done more in one evening than most would in a week." It's no problem, I replied, glancing up at him. I just want to do a good job. You already are, he said, his gaze steady. His hand brushed against mine as he opened the door, a touch so light it could have been accidental. But when I looked at him, the air between us shifted. Time seemed to slow. His eyes searched mine, and I felt a pull, subtle but undeniable. I should have stepped away, made an excuse, anything to break the moment. But I didn't. I couldn't. When he leaned in, it wasn't sudden or forceful. It was deliberate, as if he were giving me a chance to stop him. I didn't. His lips met mine, soft but certain, and for a fleeting second, the weight of everything, my marriage, my responsibilities, disappeared. I pulled back first, my breath catching in my throat. I should go, I said quickly, my voice barely above a whisper. Of course, he replied, stepping back to give me space. His tone was calm, but his eyes held something I couldn't name, a mix of regret and longing. As I walked to my car, my mind raced. What had I just done? The rational part of me screamed that it was a mistake, but another part, the part that had felt invisible for so long, clung to the memory of his touch. When I got home, Jason was already asleep. I slipped into bed beside him, careful not to wake him. My body was still, but my thoughts wouldn't rest. The warmth of Ed's kiss lingered on my lips, and with it came a realization that terrified me. I wanted to feel it again. Jason had already left by the time I woke up. His side of the bed was cold, the faint scent of his cologne lingering on the pillow. I stared at the ceiling, the events of the previous night replaying in my mind. Ed's kiss lingered like a forbidden secret, warm and dangerous. My stomach churned with guilt, but alongside it was something I couldn't ignore. A flicker of longing. By the time I got to work, I was determined to bury those thoughts. The office buzzed with its usual energy, but I felt like an outsider in my own world, hyper-aware of every glance, every movement. I tried to keep my focus on the tasks ahead, but when I passed Ed's office, my heart skipped a beat. I caught a glimpse of him through the glass, leaning over his desk, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He looked up, and for a brief moment, our eyes met. I turned away quickly, hoping he hadn't noticed the heat rising to my cheeks. Mid-morning, I was at my desk, trying to concentrate, when my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen, and my breath caught. It was a message from him. Good morning. Did you sleep well? The words were simple, almost innocent, but they carried a weight that made my pulse quicken. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the screen. I should have ignored it, but instead, I typed back. Not much sleep, honestly. You? His reply came almost instantly. Same. Maybe it's the after effects of a late night. I stared at the message, my chest tightening. There was no explicit meaning, but the implication was there, woven between the words. I placed my phone face down on the desk, determined not to let this escalate, but the memory of his gaze, his voice, the brief touch of his hand, it all swirled in my mind, refusing to be silenced. By lunchtime, the tension had built to an unbearable degree. I had buried myself in work, hoping to drown out the thoughts, but my focus kept slipping. When my phone buzzed again, I didn't even need to look to know who it was. Can you come by my office? I need your input on something. The rational part of me screamed to decline, to find an excuse, but I was already on my feet, walking down the corridor toward his office. The door was slightly ajar, and I knocked lightly before stepping in. He looked up from his desk, his expression softening when he saw me. Close the door, he said, his voice calm but firm. I hesitated, then pushed it shut behind me. The sound of the latch clicking into place felt louder than it should have, as though marking the line I was about to cross. How are you? He asked, leaning back in his chair. I'm fine, I said, though the word felt like a lie. Just busy. He nodded, watching me intently. About last night. His voice trailed off, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. It was a mistake, I said quickly, cutting him off. It shouldn't have happened. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. I know, and I'm not asking for anything, but I can't pretend it didn't mean something to me. His honesty hit me like a punch to the chest. I looked away, focusing on a stack of papers on his desk, but I could feel his gaze on me. Ed, I can't, I began, but the words faltered. I get it, he said, his tone gentle. I just needed you to know. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood, desperate to leave, to escape the suffocating pull of him. I should get back to work, I mumbled, turning toward the door. Madeline, he said, and the way he said my name stopped me in my tracks. I didn't look back, couldn't bear to. I simply opened the door and walked out, my heart pounding with every step. That night, as I lay in bed beside Jason, I stared at the dark ceiling, my mind a storm of emotions. Jason's breathing was slow and even, his presence steady and predictable. But my thoughts were elsewhere, back in Ed's office, replaying his words, his gaze. When my phone buzzed on the nightstand, I didn't need to check it to know who it was. I picked it up, my hand trembling slightly. I meant what I said. I stared at the message, torn between the urge to delete it and the urge to respond. Instead, I placed the phone face down, as though that could silence the turmoil inside me. The next day, I avoided him as best I could. I buried myself in reports, emails, anything to keep my mind occupied. But every time I saw him, even from across the office, my resolve wavered. By mid-afternoon, I found myself in the break room, pouring a cup of coffee when I heard the door swing open. I didn't need to turn around to know it was him. His presence filled the room, his steps slow and deliberate. Madeline, he said softly, his voice a whisper that seemed to wrap around me. I turned, gripping the coffee cup tighter than I needed to. Ed, I replied, my voice quieter than I intended. For a moment, neither of us moved. The air between us was thick with unspoken words, and in that silence, I felt the boundaries I had tried so hard to rebuild begin to blur once more. The message arrived mid-morning. I had been staring at my screen, attempting to draft an email, but my thoughts had drifted, tangled in the memory of Ed's words from the day before. When my phone buzzed, I almost ignored it, thinking it was just another calendar alert. But his name on the screen sent a ripple through me. Dinner tonight? Let's discuss the project in a quieter setting. I stared at the message, my stomach tightening. There was no mistaking the implication, no room for misunderstanding. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, torn between typing an excuse and agreeing. After what felt like an eternity, I replied, Sure. What time? The restaurant was a small, elegant bistro tucked into the quieter side of the city, a place that spoke of intentionality rather than chance. I arrived a few minutes early, nerves simmering beneath my calm exterior. My dress was simple, yet flattering, a choice I had agonized over for longer than I wanted to admit. Ed was already there, seated at a corner table that offered just enough privacy. He stood as I approached, his smile warm but composed. Madeline, he said, his voice carrying a softness that set me at ease and on edge all at once. You picked a nice place, I said, taking the seat he pulled out for me. I thought it suited the occasion, he replied, his words layered with meaning I didn't dare unpack. The waiter arrived, and Ed ordered a bottle of wine without hesitation. The ease with which he navigated the evening only heightened my own unease. This was a man who knew exactly what he wanted and how to get it. The conversation started professionally enough. We discussed timelines, deliverables, and potential hurdles. But as the wine flowed, the edges of our conversation began to blur. You work harder than anyone else in the office, he said, his tone shifting to something more personal. I don't think they appreciate how much you bring to the table. I felt the warmth rise to my cheeks. I'm just doing my job. Don't downplay it, he said, leaning forward slightly. You have a way of making things happen, of seeing the details everyone else misses. That's rare. His words should have felt like flattery, but there was a sincerity in his tone that made them land differently. Thank you, I said quietly, my voice catching in my throat. What about outside of work? He asked, his gaze holding mine. What makes you happy? The question caught me off guard. I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came. What did make me happy? The thought was both startling and sobering. I don't know, I admitted, the honesty surprising even myself. It's been a long time since I've thought about that. He nodded, as if he understood something I hadn't said aloud. That's the thing about life. Sometimes we get so caught up in what we're supposed to do that we forget what we want to do. His words settled heavily between us, the unspoken implications impossible to ignore. My hand tightened around the stem of my wineglass as I struggled to find something to say, something that would shift the conversation back to safer territory. But the truth was, I didn't want to. By the time we left the restaurant, the air between us was charged. We stepped into the cool night, the faint hum of the city around us. My car was parked just down the street, and we walked together in silence. When we reached the parking lot, I turned to face him, fumbling for the right words. Thank you for dinner. It was nice. He smiled, and for a moment, the silence stretched between us, heavy with everything unsaid. Madeline, he began, his voice low, almost a whisper. I know this isn't easy. For either of us. I didn't reply. Couldn't. My breath hitched as he took a step closer, his presence overwhelming. His hand reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face, the touch so gentle it sent a shiver down my spine. You deserve to feel alive, he said, and before I could process the words, his lips met mine. The kiss was different from the first, slower, deeper, as if he were giving me a choice. For a moment, the world fell away, and all that existed was the warmth of his touch, the pull of his closeness. When we finally broke apart, I stepped back, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. I have to go, I said, my voice barely audible. Of course, he replied, his tone understanding, but tinged with something else. Hope, perhaps. I turned and walked to my car, my legs trembling beneath me. As I drove home, the weight of the evening pressed down on me. Guilt warred with something far more dangerous. Desire? Jason was asleep when I got home, his steady breathing a sharp contrast to the storm raging inside me. I lay down beside him, staring at the ceiling, my lips still tingling with the memory of Ed's kiss. And for the first time in years, I felt alive. Jason was seated at the kitchen table when I came down, already immersed in his emails. The weight of the previous night lingered on me, but I smiled as though nothing had changed. I'll be late tonight, I said casually. Another meeting about the project? Jason barely looked up. You're working hard lately, he said, his tone neutral, not questioning. It's a big deal for the department, I replied, turning away to pour coffee, relieved he didn't press further. At work, the rhythm of my days shifted. Ed's messages became a lifeline, their frequency increasing. They were brief at first, updates about the project, questions about logistics. But soon they became more personal, intimate. I can't stop thinking about you. The first time he sent those words, my breath caught. My rational mind screamed to ignore them, to set boundaries, but I found myself typing back. You shouldn't. Yet the moment the words left my screen, I craved his reply. Our exchanges became a dance, carefully worded but loaded with meaning. I would pause before responding, trying to convince myself to walk away, but I never did. Each message felt like a thread tying me closer to him, making it harder to pull away. Ed began suggesting we meet outside of work more frequently. I need to see you, he said one evening after a long meeting. I hesitated, but the pull was undeniable. I agreed, knowing full well what it meant. At home, I started to weave small lies into our routine. The project is demanding, I'd say. Ed's pushing us hard. Jason would nod, offering a few words of encouragement before diving back into his work. But I could feel his eyes on me more often. His questions, though infrequent, carried a weight they hadn't before. "You've been distracted," he said one night as we sat on the couch. "Everything okay?" "Just tired," I replied quickly, avoiding his gaze. "It'll get better once the project wraps." He accepted my answer, but the unease lingered. That evening, as I lay in bed, my phone buzzed. Jason was already asleep. I turned the screen away from him and opened the message. "Tomorrow, let's get dinner." I hesitated, my fingers trembling. The lies were getting easier, and that terrified me. But the truth was even more frightening. I didn't want to say no. "Okay," I typed back. As I placed the phone on the nightstand, I glanced at Jason, his face serene in sleep. The guilt pressed down on me, heavy and relentless. But beneath it, a darker desire whispered, I wanted more. The message came in the middle of the day, just as I was finishing a report. My phone buzzed on the desk, and I glanced at the screen. It was from Edition. "Tonight, room 317, downtown Marriott, just us." My breath caught as I read the words. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. The rational part of me screamed to say no, to stop this before it went any further. But the pull toward him was stronger than logic, stronger than guilt. My fingers hovered over the keys before typing a single word. "Okay." The evening felt surreal as I prepared to leave. Jason was at his laptop, immersed in work as always. I told him I had a late meeting with Ed about the project. He barely looked up, offering a distracted, "Good luck." The drive downtown felt like stepping out of my life and into a version of myself I barely recognized. The city lights blurred past as my heart pounded, each mile bringing me closer to something I couldn't define, something thrilling, terrifying, and inevitable. When I arrived at the hotel, the lobby was quiet, its muted elegance contrasting sharply with the storm of emotions inside me. I took the elevator to the third floor, each ding of the passing floors echoing in my chest. By the time I reached the door to room 317, my hands were trembling. I knocked softly, and the door opened almost immediately. Ed stood there, his jacket off, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar. He looked at me with an intensity that made my knees weak. "You came," he said, his voice low and steady, though there was something vulnerable in his expression. I nodded, stepping inside. The door clicked shut behind me, sealing us in a space that felt removed from the rest of the world. For a moment, we stood there, the air between us heavy with unspoken words. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but before I could, he stepped closer. His hand cupped my face gently, his thumb brushing against my cheek. "I've been waiting for this," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. And then his lips were on mine, the kiss deep and consuming. It wasn't hesitant like before. It was a release, an answer to every unspoken question we'd danced around for weeks. The rest was a blur of movement and sensation. His hands traced the curves of my body with a reverence that made my skin tingle. I felt myself letting go of everything, fear, guilt, reason, until all that remained was the heat of his touch and the sound of our breaths mingling in the quiet room. Afterward, we lay side by side, the sheets tangled around us. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the city outside the window. Ed reached for my hand, intertwining our fingers. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. I nodded, though the truth was more complicated. I didn't know how to feel, elated, guilty, free, trapped. All I knew was that something had shifted irreversibly. "I don't know what happens now," I admitted, my voice barely audible. He turned to face me, his expression serious. "We figure it out. Together." The drive home was a stark contrast to the intoxicating hours I had spent with Ed. The guilt hit me like a wave the moment I stepped into the house. Jason was already asleep, his steady breathing a reminder of everything I had just betrayed. I slipped into bed beside him, careful not to wake him. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, the enormity of what I had done began to sink in. I told myself it would only be this once, that I could stop now. But deep down, I knew the truth. I didn't want to stop. Jason's eyes lingered on me longer these days. It wasn't the warm, absent-minded gaze of years past. It was sharper, as though he were trying to piece together a puzzle he couldn't quite see. I caught him watching me as I checked my phone during dinner, his fork pausing midair. "You've been glued to that thing lately," he said casually, but his tone carried an edge. "It's just work," I replied quickly, placing the phone face down on the table. "The project's intense." Jason nodded, though his expression didn't soften. "You've been distracted." "I'm just tired," I said, forcing a smile. "It'll pass once things settle down." He didn't press further, but the silence between us felt heavy, the weight of my lies pressing against the thin veneer of normalcy I had managed to maintain. At the office, the tension was no less palpable. My connection with Ed had grown into something that could no longer be hidden in casual glances or fleeting touches. The night at the hotel had changed everything, deepening the bond between us while also complicating it in ways I hadn't anticipated. We had agreed to keep our interactions professional during work hours, but restraint had never been Ed's strength. One afternoon, he appeared at my desk, leaning in slightly as he spoke. "Dinner tonight?" he asked, his voice low enough that no one else could hear. "I want to see you." I hesitated. "Is that a good idea?" "It's just dinner," he said, though the way he looked at me made it clear it wasn't just dinner. Against my better judgment, I nodded. The restaurant was quieter than the last one, tucked away in a part of the city where we were unlikely to be recognized. We spoke about the project at first, but the conversation quickly drifted into more personal territory. Ed had a way of making me feel like I was the only person in the room, his focus unwavering, his words carefully chosen. As we left the restaurant, one of my colleagues, Laura, appeared from a nearby table. My heart sank as our eyes met. Her expression shifted from surprise to something harder to read. "Madeline, Ed," she said, her tone neutral but laced with curiosity. "Didn't expect to see you two here." "It's work," Ed said smoothly, his smile disarming. "We're ironing out some last-minute details for the campaign." "Late hours?" Laura remarked, her gaze flickering between us. I forced a smile, my pulse racing. She didn't linger, but the damage was done. The way she looked at me before turning away left no doubt in my mind. She suspected something. That night, I lay awake, my mind racing. The moment with Laura replayed in my head, her raised eyebrow, the faint smirk that hinted at her conclusions. I knew I couldn't let my guard slip again, but the cracks were already forming. The next day, Ed called me into his office. His tone was tense, his posture rigid. "Laura saw us last night," he said without preamble. "I know," I said, sinking into the chair across from him. "She probably thinks something's going on." "Does she have proof?" he asked sharply. "No, but—" "Then it doesn't matter," he interrupted, his frustration clear. "What matters is us." His words, meant to reassure, only added to my anxiety. "Ed, this is getting too complicated." "What are you saying?" he asked, his voice softening but his expression hardening. "I'm saying we need to be more careful. This can't spill into work." He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You're pulling away." "I'm not," I said quickly. "But I can't lose everything, Ed. My marriage, my job." His jaw tightened, and for the first time, I saw a flash of anger in his eyes. "You think I'm not risking anything? You think this is easy for me?" "I'm not saying that," I said, my voice rising. "But you have to understand, I can't give you more than this." Ed stood abruptly, pacing to the window. "You're asking me to settle for scraps, Madeline. And I don't know if I can. The words hit me harder than I expected. I stood, my hands trembling. I need time to think, I said, my voice breaking. He didn't stop me as I left his office, but the tension in the room followed me out like a shadow. At home, Jason's questions grew more pointed. He asked about my late nights, my constant phone use, the changes in my mood. I deflected as best I could, but the walls were closing in. And in the midst of it all, Ed's words lingered. You're asking me to settle for scraps. For the first time, I wondered if I was losing control, not just of the situation, but of myself. Jason's suspicion had been simmering for weeks. I could feel it in the way his eyes lingered on me, longer than usual. In the pointed questions, he started asking about my late nights and work commitments. But I had convinced myself I was careful enough, that I could keep everything hidden. I was wrong. It happened one evening after dinner. Jason had gone upstairs to grab something, leaving his phone charging on the counter. My own phone buzzed with a message from Ed. A simple, loaded sentence. Can I see you tonight? I reached for it too quickly, my movements clumsy, and my phone slipped from my hand, landing on the floor. Jason reappeared just as I picked it up, his expression sharpening when he saw my flushed face. Who's texting you at this hour? He asked casually, but his tone carried a weight that made my stomach drop. Just work, I said, trying to sound indifferent as I placed the phone on the counter. But Jason wasn't satisfied. Before I could stop him, he picked it up, his thumb unlocking the screen effortlessly. I'd forgotten to change the passcode. Jason, don't, I began, but it was too late. His face shifted as he scrolled through the messages. Each second that passed felt like an eternity. Finally, he looked up, his expression a mix of disbelief and anger. I miss you. I can't stop thinking about last night. What the hell is this, Madeline? My breath caught, my mind scrambling for an explanation that wouldn't make things worse. It's not what you think, I said, though even I didn't believe my own words. Then explain it to me, he demanded, his voice rising. Explain why your boss is sending you messages like this. Explain why you've been lying to me. I felt tears prick at my eyes, but I forced myself to meet his gaze. I've been unhappy, Jason, I said finally, my voice trembling. I've felt invisible in this marriage for a long time. He blinked, the anger in his eyes giving way to something more painful, betrayal. And this is how you deal with it? By running to someone else? It wasn't planned, I said quickly, desperate to salvage what I could. It started as just work, but he made me feel seen. Jason's expression hardened. Did you sleep with him? I hesitated, the silence stretching unbearably. No, I lied, the word bitter on my tongue. He exhaled sharply, his hands running through his hair as he paced the kitchen. I can't believe this. I can't believe you. The next morning, Jason was gone before I woke up. The house felt colder, emptier, as if his absence had drained it of warmth. I knew I couldn't leave things as they were, but I also knew the next steps wouldn't be easy. At work, I avoided Ed as long as I could. But by the afternoon, he appeared at my desk, his expression tense. We need to talk, he said quietly. I followed him to his office, my heart pounding. Once inside, he closed the door and turned to face me. What's going on? He asked. You've been distant. Jason found out, I said bluntly, my voice low. He read our messages. Ed's jaw tightened, his frustration evident. So what now? Are you ending things? I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. I have to, Ed. I can't keep doing this. I can't lose my family. His silence stretched, heavy and oppressive. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but firm. Come with me, he said. I froze. What? Leave with me, he repeated. Start over, just us. His words struck me like a blow. I had expected anger, maybe even desperation, but not this. I can't, I whispered. You can, he insisted, stepping closer. "You're not happy, Madeline. You've said it yourself. Don't stay in a life that's killing you." Tears filled my eyes as I shook my head. "I have to try to fix things with Jason. I owe him that." Ed's face hardened, and for the first time, I saw a coldness in his eyes. "Then I guess this is it," he said. I nodded, my throat tight. "I'm sorry," I said, though the words felt hollow. As I left his office, I felt a crushing weight settle on my chest. I had made my choice, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a loss. Of Ed, of myself, of the life I had allowed to spiral out of control. Jason's words echoed in my mind. "I don't trust you anymore." He had said it that morning, his voice flat but firm, as if he had been holding it in for days. I sat at the kitchen table long after he had left for work, staring at my untouched coffee. The weight of his statement settled on me like a stone, suffocating and immovable. His trust, once a steady constant, was now shattered. And I had no one to blame but myself. Ed's messages had stopped. For days, there had been no texts, no calls, no lingering glances across the office. He had pulled away, giving me the space I had insisted on, though the emptiness it left was almost unbearable. But as the hours stretched into another quiet, lonely evening, I realized I couldn't avoid the choice any longer. I couldn't keep straddling the line between two lives, pretending I could have both. Jason's words returned to me, a cruel but honest reminder of the damage I had caused. "We can't fix this if I can't trust you," he had said. His face had been pale, his eyes glassy with emotions he refused to let spill over. "Do you even want to try?" I had asked, my voice trembling. His silence had been answer enough. I decided to meet Ed one last time. My chest felt tight as I drove to the quiet bar where we had agreed to meet. He was already there, seated in a corner booth, a drink in hand. He looked up as I approached, his expression unreadable. "Madeline?" he said softly, standing as I slid into the seat across from him. "I needed to see you," I said, my voice cracking under the weight of my emotions. He nodded, his eyes scanning my face. "I know." We sat in silence for a moment, the noise of the bar fading into the background. Finally, I found the courage to speak. "I can't do this, Ed," I said, the words painful but necessary. "I can't leave my family." He leaned back, his jaw tightening as he absorbed my words. "I figured as much," he said finally, his voice devoid of anger, but heavy with disappointment. "I didn't want it to end like this," I whispered. "Neither did I," he replied, his gaze meeting mine. "But I can't wait for something that isn't going to happen." His words struck me like a blow, final and absolute. I felt the sting of tears, but refused to let them fall. "I'm sorry," I said. He nodded slowly, standing. "Take care of yourself, Madeline." And just like that, he walked away, leaving me alone in the booth, my heart heavy with the weight of everything I had lost. That night, Jason didn't come home. I sat on the couch, staring at the darkened room, wondering if there was anything left to salvage. The choice had been made, but the consequences were just beginning. The silence in the house was deafening. Jason and I sat at opposite ends of the couch, the television flickering in front of us, though neither of us was paying attention. This had become our new normal, quiet, strained, and heavy with things left unsaid. After everything, Jason had decided to stay, but his words echoed in my mind every night. "This is your last chance." Our days were filled with polite exchanges, perfunctory routines, and a glaring absence of trust. I tried to bridge the gap, suggesting dinners, asking about his day, but his responses were short, guarded. Each effort felt like shouting into a void. At work, Ed was gone. He had taken a transfer to another branch, leaving behind an email that was as formal as it was final. "Good luck, Madeline. I hope you find what you're looking for." I stared at the screen for a long time after reading it, the words blurring as tears welled in my eyes. Ed's absence left a hollow ache I couldn't fill, a reminder of a connection I had willingly severed. Yet even as I mourned the loss of him, I couldn't deny the relief of his departure. It was easier to breathe without him in the office, without the constant reminder of what I had done, what I had lost. Jason and I had agreed to attend therapy, though the sessions felt more like navigating a minefield than finding a path to healing. "I'm trying," I said during one session, my voice cracking. "I'm trying to be the person you can trust again." Jason looked at me, his expression unreadable. "You don't just fix trust, Madeline. It's not something you glue back together." His words cut deeper than I expected. The counselor spoke about rebuilding, about time and patience, but all I felt was the weight of my failure. Nights were the hardest. Lying in bed beside Jason, I would stare at the ceiling, the silence between us stretching into the dark. My thoughts wandered to Ed, not to the moments of passion, but to the way he had made me feel alive, seen, desired. But those feelings came with a price, and I was paying it now. One evening, as I folded laundry in the quiet of the bedroom, Jason stood in the doorway. "Do you regret it?" he asked suddenly, his voice low but steady. I froze, the shirt in my hands slipping to the floor. "What? Do you regret any of it? Him?" I hesitated, my chest tightening. "I regret hurting you," I said finally. "I regret losing what we had." Jason nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I don't know if we'll ever get back to that," he admitted. His honesty was a knife, but it was also the first real crack in the wall between us. Months passed, and while the tension between us eased, the trust remained elusive. I wondered if it ever would return, or if our marriage would always carry the scars of my choices. I thought of Ed less often as time went on, though the memory of him lingered like a shadow. I had made my decision, but the weight of what could have been was something I would carry forever. As I stood by the kitchen window one quiet morning, watching the sunrise, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. My life had splintered into pieces, and I was trying, slowly, to put them back together. Would I ever fully restore what I had broken? I didn't know, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, one day, I would find myself again.